Well, as we customarily say, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
And so you can hear, that even though you can't see, that there are other people in this room, and I'm not doing this. For those of you who watch the video. Anyway, we are continuing in 1 Samuel, and we're getting nearer and nearer the end of it. After we conclude with the account of Saul and his interactions with David here, and then we'll be going to the New Testament book of Hebrews for a while, and but we're still talking about David, and this is an unusual stretch of time for David. The man after God's own heart, if we remember last week, was pleading with Saul that he had been cut off from the heritage of Israel, from the worshiping covenant community of God's people, and that he'd been essentially banished, so that it was as if he was one who had to go worship other gods. And he didn't want a drop of his blood to fall anywhere but in the promised land. And then we find, we hear here in 1 Samuel 27, these first words of 1 Samuel 27. But David thought to himself. Now that "but" is a it connects it to what had just happened before. I'm not remembering the grammatical word for and but and so forth, but anyway, it's one of those little grammatical things. It says, but David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. And it says, so in verse 2, so David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. David went to Gath of the Philistines and King Achish once before, didn't he? Mm-hmm. If you recall that I've kind of lifted out a speculative theory that perhaps David had carelessly crossed over into Philistine territory and was captured by them. There were a few little things. They obviously recognized David, the Philistines did right away, because they told Achish, he says, is this not David, king of the land, of whom they sing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? That's in 1 Samuel 21. And the text speaks of David being in their hands, which maybe suggests that he might have been in captivity. Psalm 56 reads a miktam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. And David sought to escape from being with King Achish at that time. And you remember how he did it? He pretended to be a slobbering madman, made marks on the door, whatever all that meant. And the king of Gath says, am I hurting for madmen in my kingdom that you bring this guy to me? And a really kind of humorous and ironic remark. And so they let him go. So again, maybe he went there unintentionally, or because you remember when David first fled from Saul after he had to climb out of the window when Saul's guys had surrounded his house, and Michael, ferreted him out of there, and then he went to Samuel, and they chased him to Samuel's place in Ramah, and then he went to Nob, and he got the showbread and the sword of Goliath. And then we know what happened at Nob, and that Doeg the Edomite betrayed his location, and Saul was hot on his tail, and David was really kind of running around rather frantically at that time. And that was why I kind of offered that there was maybe a chance that was unintentional, but there's certainly no speculation here about David's intentionality of going to Achish and Gath, and why he singles out this particular man. I don't know if they got acquainted on the battlefield one day or what, but either way, and if he's still carrying the sword of Goliath, that would seem rather even more interesting. But
particularly since that's where Goliath was from.
That's right.
Goliath of Gath.
Yeah, the Goliath the Gittite. That's what they would of Gath. That's right. Can you think of any reason why Achish might feel differently about David now than he did, and be more ready to accept him? And really, David is seeking asylum, but even more than that, we'll see there's a sense in which he has to enter into a bit of an alliance with this man. Why might David be not seem as much of a threat to Achish right now?
It's kind of a little thing that I think of, the enemy of my enemies is my friend.
Exactly.
Okay, and that, that's the other thing, is that if indeed he did really join, I mean, he had quite a group of fighters.
That's
He had
true.
more than just himself to offer.
Yes.
He had all the men that were with him who were magnificent warriors. So that's, had to weigh all that.
It's true. And evidently this feud between Saul and David had become common knowledge, and that Achish's response to David did have something to do with the fact we have a common enemy now. Saul's trying to kill, is an enemy of David, and Saul is an enemy of Gath, and so he was more willing to talk with him this time. It's something we learn here, and I guess we could have assumed that all along, but it's that these 600 men, these fighters you were talking about, and David are all traveling with who? Their families.
Mm-hmm.
David, remember, he called all of his brothers to come be with him when he was first hiding out. Why? Because they would have been vulnerable to retribution from Saul. I already seen what Saul did to the priests at Nob. Their families would have been in the same sort of jeopardy, and so it made their moving around and their hiding obviously logistically a lot more difficult. And instead of having to provide for 600 men, you might be having to provide for 4 times that many people. And then David, of course, he knows he's the Lord's anointed. We'll have to think about that. He knows that he's the Lord's anointed, but he says, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. I think we've got to say that thus far, even though he was in Israel and he was betrayed by the people from Judah, God's doing a pretty good job of keeping him safe. So these are some of the paradoxes we run up on in this passage.
So maybe there's an aspect of accumulation of stress in regards to just everything seems to be going from bad to worse.
Mm-hmm.
And now here I'm having to go to my traditional enemies to find asylum. Yeah. It's just like really, it's gotten to this point. Of course, it's interesting because the same with Joseph. Yeah. What happened with his brothers, and he ended up going into slavery. All he went through on his way to being two-man in Egypt. and it's fascinating. You have that story way tucked in the background of their history. And this is actually what God's doing with David. Yeah. Because this thing with the Philistines and what happens later on in chapter 3 with the Amalekites basically literally enriched David. Okay. To the point where he came back and gave gifts, first of all, to Judah and reconciled totally with his tribe, who were the first to anoint him to receive him as king. So it just shows you what all the bad things that seem to transpire, like Joseph previously, can be that which brings promotion and the thing to pass that was promised.
Well, yeah, and the you talk about being enriched by what he was doing. If we read on a little further, David goes to Achish and says in verse 5, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" And so that day Achish gave him the town of Ziklag, and therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah till this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. He was there almost 1.5 years, and so forth. Now, this idea of asking him for a land grant, I guess, was kind of like a feudal practice. Asking land grants from a king was if you were a trusted member of the court or served as a warrior for a king, it wasn't unusual to ask that you be given some land. And so David does this. Now, this is probably about 20 miles southeast of Gath. So he's basically going to have a base of operation outside the day-to-day observation of Gath and the other Philistines. So it's going to give him a measure of freedom. You have to wonder, I think I do, if, there were a lot of pragmatic reasons for David to do what he did, a lot of practical reasons. Where practicality leaves off and faith is supposed to pick up, sometimes is not as easy for us to discern. But David won't be without lapses in faith and obedience too. Not to say that God can't work good out of our lapses in faith and our disobedience from time to time, but I think we have to kind of weigh all this in evaluating how the Lord saw this. One of the things Achish says at the end of it, for he has become an utter stench to his people. Achish was counting on the fact that what David had done was detestable and seemingly traitorous in the eyes of other Israelites. Be tantamount to a guy who's getting ready to run for president here, having spent a year and a half working for ISIS or Red China, and then saying, "Oh man, you know, I'm all yours." There'd be a tendency to not be so sure about that, you know. And so this is and we know the historical animosity that existed between the Philistines and Israel, and it's really still there to this day. You know, it's no Gaza is you know, Palestinian territory, and you know, there's probably some distant descendant of those same Philistine people. But so David used this time somewhat profitably. It says when he was in Ziklag, he and his men made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Now, you brought up the Amalekites, Mike. Pretty notable people. How did Saul get in trouble for the last time with the Lord? By refusing to do what?
He refused to destroy everything, including
of the Amalekites.
Yes.
Because God said, you know, he put out the ban on the Amalekites. That goes all the way back to Exodus.
Including Agag.
Yeah, that's true. Go back and look at Exodus. When the children of Israel were wandering in the desert, it was the Amalekites attacked them kind of in a surprise attack, in an ambush, men, women, and children, the whole thing. And God said, I want the Amalekites to be wiped out. Well, they were a nomadic tribe. It wasn't so easy to pin them down. It wasn't like they had a city. They lived in the Sinai Peninsula, in the desert of Shur and the Negev and all that. But Saul failed to carry that out. And he also took plunder from them, which he was not supposed to do. So David is, in a sense, continuing the harem, the ban against those tribes that Joshua had begun when he brought the people into the land at first. These Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites in verse 8 were all inhabitants of the land. Look at that, from of old, as far as Shur. That's over 150 miles away from Ziklag. So we can see that David was ranging far and wide. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep and oxen and donkeys and camels and garments and come back to Achish. When Achish would ask, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to his people, Israel. Therefore, he shall always be my servant. There's a lot there. Of course, we talked about what he was doing. He was raiding all of these people who were all enemies of Israel. And like you said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so, not that there was a formal alliance necessarily between the Philistines and the Geshurites and the Amalekites, but they were more or less on the same side of things when it came to Israel. And so David does this. He completely wipes out these villages. He institutes the ban, the harem, where they killed everybody. And then he does take the plunder. And then he goes to Gath and to King Achish. Why would he do that? Think about feudal systems and knights and stuff like that. Why would he go back to the king?
Because he was the king. And he was there at the suffrage of the king.
True. And probably because he had all of these things that he had taken. But what would be the proper thing for you to do as a vassal of the king?
Probably give a portion of it.
To give some tribute, exactly, to take tribute to King Achish. And, he goes, oh, look what you brought here. Oh, let's go find camels. I love all these, he says, where'd you get these? And so David says, where he was raiding? He's talking about areas in the tribal apportionment of Judah. He's talking about the Kenites or the Jerahmeelites or the Negev of Judah. So he's insinuating that he's conducting raids against Israel. Now, I brought up the question in the email: does war, and there was a state of, let's face it, there was a state of war between Israel and the Philistines almost continually, a continual state of war, so to speak. Does it authorize a revised set of ethics?
All's fair. All's fair in war.
There is that's where that saying comes from. Now that's not in the Bible, though. I will point out. You
That's
can't.
not a proverb.
No, that's not one of the proverbs. All fair in love and war. And is all fair. I mean, obviously, we don't really feel that way because we have war crimes. All was fair, then there wouldn't be such a thing as a war crime.
Well, and war crimes are crimes against humanity. Under that broad definition.
True. And what was David doing when he was raiding those villages?
Slaughtering everybody.
Yeah. So, I mean, David is building trust, admittedly, with an enemy, but he's not treating David like an enemy. He's given David land. He's given David the benefit of his benevolence and his care, and he's building trust with this man on false pretenses. Again, this is questionable behavior, clearly. I don't know that there's we can think of some pragmatic reasons why he might have been justified, but by the fact that he went into Philistia in the first place, he started painting himself into this corner. And he had to know at some point there was going to become a reckoning would have to come, because as an ally of King Achish of Gath, it only meant one thing: sooner or later he's going to have to fight against who? Against his own people. And that certainly would have put him on the wrong side of the battle. And David probably learned a lot while he was there. Like as Mike was pointing out, how he made himself wealthier. Also, all the archaeological evidence indicates that the Philistines were much more technically advanced people than Israel. Their skill in metallurgy, they had superior weaponry and chariots. And if you remember when we first started talking about the Philistines, you remember where they were descended from? Originally a maritime people, and they came from Greece and the area of Crete. And so during the Homeric era, and so they would have had battle tactics that were far different than the sort of guerrilla warfare that the most of these tribal people would be doing. So the Philistines were really a pretty formidable enemy, and also really a pretty advanced one. And David may have learned a lot about fighting. He was obviously a good fighter himself, but those are some of the things that David accrues while he's here, and probably ends up using them for the benefit of the Lord. But his some of his decisions here are, you have to, it's really hard to justify building trust with anybody on the basis of lies. And a lie is a lie. And I don't think, and you know what, this doesn't this point you back to other places in scripture? You think of a patriarch who said, oh no, she's not my wife, she's my sister.
Abraham.
Oh, yeah.
Not once, but twice.
Pharaoh and a black car.
Uh-huh. It sure did. And it brought real trouble on the other men who entered into the relationship with innocently enough, and were misled by Abraham. But God did vindicate Abraham out of those things. I don't know that God necessarily approved of Abraham's behavior.
What's fascinating, and there's a parallel here in regards to what happened with David, because Ziklag, and then later going after the Amalekites and basically just spoiling them too. Okay. Is that the half truth that Abraham told twice greatly enriched him.
It did.
In Egypt. I mean, he was given a huge amount of livestock, men and men, all sorts of servants, and so much so for when they went after the kings that took Sodom and Lot, he had nearly 400, between 350, 400 armed men in his household.
Yeah.
His
Delta Force.
he had an incredible retinue with him, and he came back. And of course, one of those female servants that ended up getting him in real trouble in regards to the female servant that happened to be handmaid of Sarah.
Yeah.
And Sarah's suggestion caused problems that exist to this day, but it's parallel. I mean, he a huge part of his wealth came from that time where he told this half truth, half lie, however, and came by enriched. And the same with, and I don't understand that except for somehow concurrence.
I know. I don't think in any way, shape, or form God would encourage any of us to lie. It's not to say that He can't work good out of even our worst moments and our worst decisions. But that shouldn't be an incentive to me to think, well, I'll just go ahead, because we're sin reigns, grace abounds, and there's that, but
there's something about warfare though, in regards to, it puts you really in catch-22 in difficult times. I think of Corrie ten Boom.
Yeah.
And they are asked point blank by the SS, where are the Jews?
Yeah.
Where are the Jews? How do you answer that? In a secret compartment right there in your.
It's true.
Well, they're right there. No.
So you lie.
They did. They did.
Situation.
Well, so we have this tale of David's.
War makes for an evil, makes for really strange.
And we find that war is not excluded from God's economy. I mean, and He has used war for His own purposes, even at times, and to take the promised land, to give it back, to take it away, and to punish His own people with it. So, but I said David's little charade. David had to realize, like I said, at some point that he was going to there was going to be a comeuppance. At some point, this relationship with the Philistines was going to put him in between a rock and a hard place. And he is getting to the point where he has painted himself into a corner. And that's really where we go next when David is called in by Achish to say, yeah, we're mustering for war against Israel. And so there's a delicate conversation that takes place there. But we'll see again how in his providence, God sort of comes to the rescue of the thing. And in the meantime, at the same time this is going on, we're going to see the final rejection and demise of Saul, which is really a tragic character in truest sense of the word. And he, we have to deal with his consorting with the witch or the medium of at Endor in the next chapter. As this whole warfare thing, the clouds of war gathering on the high. These are going to be dark days for Israel because there's no real leadership in the land for Saul or David or Samuel, and so that's where we'll be going next week. So until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. All right.
Have a good week. And you get Monday off, huh? A week from Monday.
Yeah, no, not tomorrow, but the next.